Good afternoon. As the Senior Patient Advisor in the Center for Patients and Families, I work with our 95 patient advisors and our 17 different councils to promote the patient and family's perspective in the healthcare arena. Using the principles of patient and family-centered care as our model, we work to improve the patient experience of all levels here at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Inpatient, outpatient clinics, the Brigham Research Institute, service lines, and with the administration. Working with our Chief Medical Officer, Stan Ashley, and Chief Nursing Officer, Jackie Somerville, as our co-chairs on the Patient and Family-Centered Care Steering Committee, we are able to support and address changes throughout the hospital. When we enter the hospital, for the most part, we carry anxiety and concern, either for ourselves, a loved one, or a friend. The application of patient and family-centered care principles opens the lines of communications so that the patient and family voices can be incorporated in the care process from the beginning. I'm going to talk to you about those principles. The first one is respect and dignity. Healthcare practitioners listen to and honor the patient and family perspectives and choices, patient and family knowledge, their values, their beliefs, and their cultural background. They are all incorporated into the planning, delivery of care. Information sharing. Healthcare practitioners communicate and share complete and unbiased information with patients and families in ways that are affirming and useful. Patients and families receive timely, complete, and accurate information in order to effectively participate in their care and in the decision-making. Participations. Patients and families are encouraged and supported in participating in the care and decision-making at the level of which they choose. And also, collaboration. Patients and families are also included on an institution-wide basis. Healthcare leaders collaborate with patients and families in policy and program development, implementation and evaluation, in healthcare facility designs, and in professional education, as well as in the delivery of care. We stress that all participants on the team be mindful of their communications with patients and families and their colleagues. When patients and families come here with a behavioral health disorder or diagnosis, their challenges are further exacerbated by the fact that many people do not understand and that the solutions to their health crisis is not like a standard broken arm or a diabetic event, but is far more complex scenario. I'd like to read to you a letter that's been composed by some patients with mental health issues. It may help you. It certainly has helped me. Dear family, this letter is a plea for your compassion, understanding, and patience. We have all just come through an episode of my mental illness. I've experienced it personally, and you've tried to deal with its effects while continuing to take care of our family as a whole. It has not been easy, but I have done my best, and the best I know how, and I know you have too. For this, I thank you. As a result of this episode, I am now exhausted. Maybe I look all right to you, but inside I am wounded. Even the least little stress, the least effort is overwhelming to me. I need to just sit and pull myself together. I need to sleep a lot and not do much at all. This may go on for quite some time. It may be hard for you to see me this way. You may feel it's your duty to help me get back on track, move out of it. You may be wondering if I'm using this as an excuse to be lazy. Please be gentle with me and let me heal. If you want to do something for me, there are 3 things I would appreciate. Learn about my illness. This is an illness of the brain and body, just like any other disease. It also affects my ability to think, feel, and behave. Those effects may have been difficult for you to deal with. I'm sorry if the effects of my illness have made your life more difficult. Learning about my illness may help you to put these difficulties into perspective. Help me find effective treatment. This takes patience and persistence. In my present state, I may not have the energy to follow through by myself. I may need you to advocate for me until we find people and medications that will help. The other thing you can do for me is to really listen with an open heart and an open mind. Don't try to advise me. Just listen while I work this out for myself. Your trust and understanding during this time of rest and recuperation will help me feel confident enough to decide when I am able to step, perhaps gradually, back into life's activities once more. Thank you for your support and compassion. It will make my path to recovery more smooth and sure. With thanks and hope. I have to have a disclosure here that I have a sister who for 39 years has had a bipolar diagnosis, and this letter was very helpful to me in understanding that. We are working here at the Brigham to improve the collaboration with the Boston chapter of NAMI. If any of you are not familiar with NAMI, it's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They have offices here, and they provide support groups, training, educational materials, and classes for patients, families, and staff, all free of charge. These programs can have a powerful impact on the patient and families that participate in them. Knowledge is power. We will be making more educational materials available here at the Brigham in the appropriate waiting areas and looking for additional ways to collaborate with NAMI and other programs in the future, hoping that this will make a difference in the support. We cannot control the outcomes, but we can influence the patient and family experiences through awareness and the use of patient and family-centered care principles. We are working as part of the entire team to support all aspects of their care in order to provide the best care and treatment for each patient and family that we encounter. There's information on the tables outside, so as you leave, please pick up anything that you find interesting. And you can also contact me in the Center for Patients and Families, which is located near the Kessler Library and the Surgical Liaison Waiting Area behind the information desk at 75 Francis Street. I look forward to seeing you, and thank you.
Thank you, Marty. David?
Sure. Good afternoon. I've got 8 minutes, so I'm going to do a flyover for my slides here. I just need to bring them up. Let's see, where are they here? There we go. Okay. Let's get it on slide deck here. Got it. Nope. Lost it again. Oh, there we go. Got it. Okay. So we have a problem in mental health care. This may be no surprise to you that we have a large percentage of our population who have a behavioral health problem or a mental health problem that's either undetected or certainly undertreated. Here's an example. There are 42 million American adults in America that suffer from an anxiety disorder. If you look at the pie chart here, 86% either have no treatment or inadequate treatment. And we often talk about the patients we see in our clinics, where we can provide services that we believe are evidence-based, that are scientific. There are many, many people who will never get into a clinic, never get into a hospital system or see a professional. So this is an ongoing issue, and it's becoming, and it's not just a mental health issue. It's now increasingly recognized that the comorbidity of mental health and medical problems is creating just additional suffering for patients and a burden on the system. So you can see the overlap here of folks with mental health disorders have a much higher risk of having a medical condition, and those with a medical condition also have a high risk of having one or more mental health issues. And here's a list of different conditions where there's a prevalence of comorbid mental health or behavioral health issues with medical disease. And within our department, we really focus on that intersection of mental health and medical illness and that comorbidity. And it isn't that one necessarily causes the other. There's a sort of a tight intersection that occurs depending on the condition, the medical issue, and the mental health issue. And the costs of mental health comorbidity are enormous. And this is why, I've been doing this for 30 years in my career, and often mental health care has been the loss leader in health systems because it generally isn't a moneymaker, it isn't a procedural approach. But when you now combine it with looking at it as a cost driver, it is a huge problem. And so there's now a much greater interest, frankly, from an economic point of view, to really address the comorbidity. Obviously, we should do it for quality of life and improving the well-being of our population, but it's even more of an imperative now. So there's this comorbidity that impacts symptoms, quality of life, and the economics as well. And then there's a higher risk of premature mortality associated with the comorbidity. Along with that, we've had the development of this phenomenon of technology that we all now own, right? Most of us have probably in our pocket right now or our purse some kind of device, most often a smartphone, not necessarily, but a device where there's the opportunity to message, to communicate, as well as to use devices that can monitor our behaviors in ways that just didn't exist 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. And there's a movement called the quantified self. Happened on the West Coast, it's moving east. It's basically the notion that with these wearables, with these devices, we can have a better appreciation of ourself and our activities, our behaviors, our challenges, and we can do that ourselves. So it's the quantified self idea. But then the question becomes, what do I do with that information? Should I share that? Will there be value in that? What are the concerns about that? So just as a flyover, I'm going to give you an example of a study that's emerged that we're participating in. We're very excited about because we really think it is cutting edge. Indeed, it's one of the largest trials underway now, funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. It is with a commercial partner in Massachusetts, in Boston, Cogito Corporation, which is a company that actually developed out of the MIT Media Lab in Alex Pentland's work on looking at sensor data. If we were to take the data that's being collected in our phones and we aggregate that data, can we use that in some meaningful way, both to share back with you about your own patterns of behavior, as well as to share with clinicians in some kind of a clinic setting? And that's really what this study is about. It's both parts of this. So we call it the dashboards for clinician monitoring of patients through a mobile sensing platform. So I actually have the device that has the app that was created to detect the changes in patterns of activity that I do on this phone. So it measures GPS, so it measures my location and where I am in the world. It measures my call logs and my text logs, not the content of them. That's important to emphasize, but rather changes in patterns over time. So you might ask, well, what does that have to do with mental health? Well, actually, it's very important to us to know if somebody is depressed and they become withdrawn, they may have less activity. That would be shown in a change in GPS pattern over time. That's the kind of signal analysis work that's been done at Cogito Corp, doing a lot of machine learning, algorithm development. I won't go into all those details, but trust me, a lot of investment, capital, and resources to build that capability, to actually build the capacity for the device to learn your particular unique pattern. So this is a randomized control study, as I said, funded by NIMH, that's going to randomize patients who are recruited from one of the advanced patient-centered medical homes at the Brigham, the South Huntington Clinic. And the reason we want to do it there is because they have co-located behavioral health providers. And we're interested in having the information that's being collected on the phone, in this case for me, aggregated and shared with my clinician to see if it adds value in the clinical care that they're going to provide to me in the clinic. So it has both the app on the phone and it has a dashboard. So this is a look at the app that I now have on my phone, and it helps me to understand my patterns. Now, the one signal I didn't mention that Cogito's also developed, which is really cool, is their voice analysis technology. So I have an app that allows me to just simply record a conversation, a daily event that I had, or just for me to call the number, do a recording, and the algorithm on the back end analyzes that voice recording, not for the content, not the semantics, but changes in pitch, the amount of words I use, the volume of speech, and it uses that pattern recognition capability at the cloud level to determine whether there's been a change in my affect over time. And that gets synthesized, aggregated, and transduced into a rating of mood over time. So they've done studies, Doppler studies with veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with PTSD, and validated that these signals actually do correlate with standardized measures of depression and depressive disorder. So there's some really fascinating evidence that supports this, but it's really never been used in the context of a clinical setting or clinical encounter. So it's the sensors in the phone that are used to measure the changes in social and movement patterns. The app automatically detects changes in the mood, quality of sleep, and social connectedness based on those pattern changes over time. And the app can display that. So for me individually, as a sort of quantified self person, I could use it for self-monitoring, self-management, without sharing it in the clinic setting. But what's really exciting is this, and this is a quick snapshot, it's a lot of information here, but basically this is taking the signals from a range of individuals will be in the study, and it will display the different parameters for the clinician. And we've trained the clinician in how they would go about using these data streams in the context of their care for patients in the patient-centered medical home. We're just starting the recruitment enrollment November 1st. Study will go for another 2 years. We'll be analyzing, obviously, a lot of measures in terms of functional status, mood, and mental health state, as well as looking at use of services as well. So, very exciting time. I think we're at a real changing world now with mental health care, and I'm just very excited. Can answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much. Hadine.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be able to shift gears a little bit and represent some of the work that we've been doing here, understanding the endocrine basis of mood disorders in women. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit about the field as an overview and then my own work, particularly in menopause and mood, on behalf of my research team and the NIH-funded study. So why women's health? Why is it important? Well, the World Health Organization highlights it here to say that depression is twice as common in women as men, more persistence, more recurrence. And that has a significant contribution to global burden disability in this world. As depression is going to be the second leading cause of disability, reducing depression burden in women would make a significant contribution to reducing burden of illness in the world. There are many, many, many factors contributing to susceptibility to women's mental health burden. And the work that I'm going to be doing is highlighting this first one, which has been really to validate the biology and to validate for women that the experience of mood disturbance they have does have an endocrine basis, and that the brain is an end organ for female reproductive hormones. The spectrum of women's health has focused a lot on these reproductive transition mood disorders in terms of postpartum depression, menopause-related depression, and menstrual cycle-related mood disturbance. But there are many other factors, including conditions that are more common in women, and also gender-specific considerations for individualized treatment that is gender-specific. So I'm going to be talking more about this first circle in pink here. So I started out in this field when my patients told me, what's important to study? And one person here said, why did I become depressed for the first time when I went through menopause? And that sent me 20 years ago and down my career path that I've been pursuing. The risk of depression in men and women, we know, diverges here in the reproductive years, around the time typically of menarche and continuing through menopause. And it's during that time that there are marked fluctuations in reproductive hormones across the menstrual cycle and, of course, in pregnancy as well. But the notion is that the female brain is not exposed to stable levels of reproductive hormones, but changing levels both in estradiol, progesterone, and others. And this is under a really elegant control of the HPO axis, the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, which I won't be getting into. But certainly we know that estradiol and progestins and androgens have very marked effects throughout multiple regions of the brain, well beyond the reproductive axis, including regions involved in cognition, affect, and others. And just one example of some early work highlighting the power through which these effects can translate into even anatomical changes. In an animal study in rat estrus cycle, we've been able to see that as estradiol is highest in the proestrus phase, the dendritic spine density actually increases and then decreases. So this is a dynamic system that the female brain has to adapt to. And for many women, this doesn't translate into any mood problems, fortunately, but certainly in a susceptible group, for reasons we don't always understand why, this does predispose to mood disturbance. So I mentioned the reproductive transition, the reproductive years, and marked by the end by menopause. And just to highlight, the perimenopause here is on average 4 years leading up to the final menstrual period, and is characterized by irregular menstrual cycles and changes in reproductive hormones. These reproductive hormones here, and if you look under peri here, include estradiol that fluctuates much more widely, including much higher than at times than in the premenopausal women, and certainly periods of low estradiol, and progesterone as an indicator of ovulation following. Whereas after the final menstrual period in the early postmenopause, estradiol is very low levels and not fluctuating substantially. And the key symptom marker of this transition is hot flashes, which are also a neuropsychological symptom driven by estrogen fluctuations. And they increase both in intensity and frequency across this transition. So a number of years ago, we convened an NIH panel looking at what the strongest evidence were for the symptoms that are correlated with depression, with menopause. And the first three here really are brain symptoms, with depression being one of them that I'm going to be speaking about, and a doubling of risk of depression in the transition. When women present with depression in the transition, they often present with this clustering of symptoms, hot flashes and sleep disturbance. And one of the questions has been is if there's a biological drive for this mood disturbance across the transition, are these menopause symptoms of hot flashes and sleep fragmentation driving that risk? Is that where the biology lies, or is it the brain's response to these fluctuating hormone levels? So we know that these symptoms occur more commonly. It can present with a severe clinical depression. Most commonly, it's a milder depression. And these symptoms are, and I'll show you some evidence, associated with both the fluctuating hormone levels and also the menopause symptoms. And what this has been the focus of a lot of my research, to really validate for women that what they are experiencing, yes, it's in their head and it's very much in their brain, and they are responding to these hormonal changes. So one of the ways we've done this is to take a translational clinical interventional approach where we actually manipulate hormones temporarily in healthy volunteers under highly regulated study conditions. And the importance of doing that, as I mentioned, these symptoms often co-occur, and you can't figure out what's chicken and what's egg. You can't figure out what came first. If you're going to help clinicians identify a target for treatment, you want to know what mechanistically is driving these symptoms. So what we do is we take healthy volunteers, and we administer a FDA-approved GnRH agonist called Leuprolide, which is known widely to cause hot flashes in about 2/3 of individuals, and in 1/3 do not get hot flashes. It basically suppresses estradiol rapidly within 2 weeks for a brief period of time until the injectable form is released from the system. This Leuprolide, as I said, is used, FDA approved, it's used for fibroids, it's used to treat endometriosis, and it's most commonly used to treat prostate cancer, and some of the work that I've been doing translates very directly to prostate cancer, where men get the same hot flash response and the same lethargy response and sleep disturbance. So we look at within subject changes in sleep by doing polysomnographic studies before and after, which are EEG monitoring of activity. We also look at mood within subject changes in mood to identify whether new onset hot flashes in a hypoestrogenic individual leads to mood changes. What we found in terms of sleep is that proportionate to the number of nighttime hot flashes that an individual develops, we see greater disruption of sleep measured by WASO, wake after sleep time onset, of fragmentation index, and also the number of awakenings. Very validating to women and men who experience hot flashes. And when we take this a step further and look at the impact of these hormone changes and symptoms on hot flash, on mood, we see that similarly nighttime but not daytime symptoms lead to mood disturbance, as well as the sleep fragmentation. So for an individual who has mood disturbance, in the context of these hormone changes, targeting nighttime hot flashes is important. We typically see women who have stable mood disorders who ultimately have a breakdown of their mood and break through their medication in the context of hormone fluctuation. In another complementary study, which is an observational study with frequent weekly monitoring of mood and reproductive hormones in women with depressive symptoms, we see here highlighted in the red as a summary that the more normative the hormone profile is, the better the mood. The more disruptive the hormone profile with highly variable estradiol levels, absence of progesterone indicating ovulation, the worse the mood, and only in the hypoestrogenic woman who doesn't make estrogen for a period of time in the perimenopause do we see a major hot flash effect. So to summarize some of this work, as we try and understand what are the risk factors, how do we understand the biology of targetable symptoms to both validate women's experience and also intervene symptomatically in somebody who's overwhelmed with multiple symptoms. We know that the fluctuating hormones with the estradiol and the absence of progesterone contribute both to the mood disturbance and independently to hot flashes. And we know that these nighttime vasomotor or hot flash symptoms contribute to sleep and to mood. And separately, there's an independent effect of nighttime symptoms on mood. So I'll thank my research team for their work on this and turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Because of time limitations, Hadine wasn't able to tell you about her intervention studies, but what's exciting and I think indicative of this sort of work translationally is that based upon the biology, she has, and her team, has developed interventions that are biologically based that can target these processes and can produce relief in patients. And ultimately, that's why we're here, is to produce relief in patients. So we've heard that psychiatric disease is prevalent and has an enormous impact. 1 out of every 4 people at least suffers with some sort of psychiatric illness. If you add addictions, and there's currently an epidemic that's increasing, it goes beyond half of the population, potentially. And in certain patient populations, like multiple sclerosis, it can be up to 75% of patients. And it's not just because they have a psychological, quote-unquote, reaction to a difficult situation, which they certainly do, and we need to attend to, but it's because the brain is the organ of the mind. And the more we understand about the organ that makes us who we are and what regulates it biologically, in the context of the environment, the more we can be effective in advancing our understanding of these disorders and developing new treatments for our patients. What we want to do is transcend traditional boundaries of fields. I'm a neurologist as well as a psychiatrist. It's one organ. We have 2 different departments, but it's one organ. In fact, we have neurosurgery as well, and neuropathology and neuroradiology, and it's all part of the Institute for the Neurosciences here. And we work together in order to be able to look at the confluence of these fields to be able to help our patients. What we want to do in psychiatry is do what other fields are doing, what cancer is doing, what cardiovascular disease is doing. The reason why it's taken longer in psychiatry is not just the residual stigma and misunderstanding and residual dualism, because it's hard for people to understand that the mind is something, comes from something physical, even though it itself has its own causal mechanisms through that organ. But also because we're dealing with the most complex functions of the most complex organ, so it simply takes longer to work out the mechanisms in a tractable way. So what we need to do is bridge the basic science, cellular and molecular science and neuroscience, with systems level neuroscience, which I'll talk about today, and then bring that in the classic sense of the BRI here from the bench to the bedside in a way that we can do best in a hospital environment. You heard a little bit about this from Hadine, but I just want to briefly highlight some of the brain systems that we focus a lot on in the Functional Neuroimaging Laboratory, directed by Emily Stern, and also in our department more broadly. We focus on evolutionarily conserved systems, but systems where, even in terms of that relative evolutionary conservation, with further evolution from reptiles into mammals and then into primates and then Homo sapiens, you end up with disorders, human psychiatric disorders, that can't be fully modeled in animals, and you need to understand the human biology itself. Here you see on the left In the picture of the brain, the guy walking in the woods, the amygdala system, which is a part of a salience sensing system that, and an emotional memory system that's involved, in this case, in threat detection. And on the right, stress systems that involve the not just the hypothalamic pituitary axis and adrenocorticoid axis, but higher order limbic and even frontal systems in the brain that regulate it based upon one's predisposition as well as one's settings, if you will, of a number of different signaling pathways and neurotransmitter systems and neural circuits in the brain. There are certain regions that we tend to focus on in the lab and in the field because these are regions, and I won't go into them here, that are highly interconnected and also have very complex cytoarchitectonics and connectivity within them that regulate not only emotional behavior, but the higher order thought that we are capable of and the regulation or control of emotion and behavior, which is something that we focus a lot on because it's not just too much or too little of something, but the thermostat itself that may be broken in a number of these cases. And we need to understand the feed forward and the feedback mechanisms and the connectivity among brain regions that mediate these symptoms and these disorders. So essentially, we're focusing upon emotional systems, sort of negative aversive systems, focused around the amygdala and anterior hippocampus, reward and motivation systems, focused on the nucleus accumbens and ventral striatum, and control and modulation systems, focused upon orbitomedial prefrontal regions. And again, I won't point them out and go into details, but that allow us to understand these disorders on a systems level. And we've developed probes that allow us, in living, breathing people, to be able to assess the integrity of these neural circuits and final common pathways, and then to be able to do what's crucial in psychiatry, which is to move beyond a descriptive, subjective taxonomy of these disorders, which is the current state of affairs, to a biologically based one, just like every other medical illness, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, without devaluing the psychological or the sociocultural, which are crucial elements as well. And in the Venn diagram on the bottom right here, you see that a number of traditional disorders, as traditionally defined, there's a tremendous overlap and even heterogeneity within them. And we need to understand the individual variability, just like for cancer, that drives the illness in any given patient, because therein lies the targets or the target for that patient's more specific treatment. We use functional MRI and PET scanning, and I won't go into the details there, but we also combine it with multimodal biomarkers, physiologically, hormonally, and increasingly in terms of the genetics, epigenomics, metabolomics, immunomics, to be able to create a multidimensional space, if you will, in which we can characterize a person's biology and understand what's going on. We do this by virtue of the fact that there are blood flow and oxygenation changes that track with neuronal activity changes in the brain locally when certain brain areas and regions and circuits are active. To just give you a couple of examples before I finish of what this can lead to is, in this particular case, it is a pattern of brain activity. And again, I won't go into details here, but for those of you who are more neurobiologically inclined, you'll see some of the key regions I've been speaking about. And the bottom line, and what we're excited about with this, is that in a data-driven way, without the computer knowing who was depressed and who was not depressed, who was healthy, this pattern of activity separates out and accounts for the variance and can allow us to potentially have a foundation for future diagnostic tests, although it's way premature for that, and then also targeted therapeutics. Those targeted therapeutics can include deep brain stimulation, and we have a DBS program here. This is an example where we can identify differences in the brain and localize differences between two forms of anxiety, panic and post-traumatic stress disorder. They're both anxiety, but if you think about it, panic is internally viscerosomatically driven. The person thinks they're having a heart attack, they have hyperventilate, whereas PTSD is an external threat that gets recapitulated in the limbic system. Schizophrenia, you can have a situation where, and this is early work we did, where you can identify the brain areas that are active when a patient hears voices and sees things that are not there. You can also test hypotheses translationally, in this case, about whether the fear system and threat system, which evolved to protect us, is aberrantly active in paranoid delusions, where the person's brain essentially is telling them that there's a threat even when there's not a threat, and there is a hyperactivation of the threat amygdala system in the presence of and driven by a decreased top-down modulation from prefrontal regions. And we can use transcranial magnetic stimulation to be able to modulate that. We can use cognitive behavioral therapy to modulate that. And this is an example from our lab where you can see before and after cognitive behavioral therapy with reduction in paranoia. In yellow on the right, you have engagement of the dorsal anterior cingulate and dorsolateral prefrontal cortices that are involved in executive function and top-down modulation, and a quieting down of that amygdalar fear response deep in the brain that you see in purple. One last statement, that we're also taking approaches to inflammation and understanding the role of inflammation in these disorders. And in depression, there is a growing literature of pro-inflammatory cytokines and other immune abnormalities that are relevant. And we have the ability to start to stratify within and across diagnoses in ways, just like genetics, that can begin to pull out the patterns that are relevant in these cases and ultimately lead us to a biological mapping and taxonomy such that different clusters define different subsyndromes, and individual patients can be mapped in terms of the signaling pathways that are and brain circuits that are abnormal in them, thus leading to treatment. And so, to finish, we have a situation where we are developing multimodal biomarkers that can start to provide a foundation for biological diagnostics and classification in psychiatry, and start to give us targets for developing new treatments, and ultimately early intervention and prevention, which is the holy grail. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, sir. So the theme for today is discovery and innovation. So I thought I might sum up just by reflecting on what is the purpose of all the discovery and innovation. Why do we do it? Where are we spending our time and effort as a group of researchers and clinicians and as a society, and why is that? And what has changed recently in the fields of neurology and psychiatry that I think gives us an enormous amount of hope for what is ultimately the reason why we do this, which is to develop therapeutics that address serious problems that make a big improvement in the lives of patients and those who care for and about them. It's interesting, if you look sort of big picture, cardiovascular disease costs the U.S. about $265 billion a year to care for for about 700,000 patients. Dementia alone costs about $200 billion to care for 5.5 million patients. Oncology, cancer costs about $100 billion a year to care for about 1.5 million patients. So the numbers certainly are only one way of looking at it, but it gives you a scale of dementia alone as one important neurologic disease relative to other diseases which are certainly very important and devastating. And yet, if you look at NIH funding as one measure of where we put our efforts, the NIH spends about $500 million a year on neurologic disease, actually about $450 million. $5.5 billion on cardiovascular disease, about $2.5 billion on neurologic disease. So why is it that a disease area that costs more than twice as much as cancer, affects 4 times as many patients, gets 1/10 of the funding. Well, you know, unfortunately, historically, there have been some good reasons, because it's extremely difficult, or for those of us who grew up in the Boston area would say it's wicked hard. In general, when we seek to develop a new therapeutic, we need some understanding of the biology. Ideally, we'd like some genetic validation that that biology matters, that there are patients who overexpress or underexpress a protein, and as a result, they have the disease with greater likelihood or less likelihood, or they do better or worse than others who have the disease. If we have some genetic validation and a sense of the biology, we hope we have a drug that might modulate that biology. Then we hope we have a way to measure that the drug actually engages with the pharmacological target. And when all that is said and done, we hope we have a way to measure objectively in patients that it makes a difference according to clinical outcomes that we can recognize and measure. In neurology, that has been very, very difficult, but we've made a lot of progress in understanding the biology of diseases. In many instances, we have some genetic validation. We have improved tools in imaging and biomarkers to help us understand whether the drug is engaging with the target. You know, one thing that we don't have that's very good are objective ways to measure outcomes in patients. But with all of that, we've made a lot of progress. In psychiatry, almost everything that I said is the way of progress in neurology hasn't been true. It's been trial and error, and a lot of the trying and mistaking stopped a while ago in a lot of fields. Happily, things are changing, and in a big way, and I think some of the work that was shared today provides a lot of evidence of that. More recently, some of the trends in investment in neurology, and again, not to talk about the money as the only measure, but in some ways it reflects the opportunity as well as the need to make a difference. Things have changed. And so I think as researchers, as caregivers, as family members, as patients, we all have a lot of reasons for optimism and hope. And for me personally, it's certainly a great honor to be here on the panel with people who are involved in doing that research and also helping families and their patients today. So thank you very much. I thought what I might do is begin with just a few questions, start the conversation, and if you want to jump in from the audience, please do so. And if we run out of conversation here, then we certainly will turn to the audience as well. Let me begin as a panel who's involved in research, in clinical care, in patient support. We all want to make a difference, so we turn to the areas that we think could matter most in importance and where we might have the greatest possibility of making a difference as well. So from your perspective, what would you see as sort of the greatest opportunities or the greatest areas of clinical and social and patient need today within the field of behavioral and mental health? And maybe start with Martie and move our way down the panel.
Well, I think like everything else, it usually comes down to communication, understanding those silly phrases that put yourself in the other person's shoes. Those types of things can really help. Working in collaboration and sharing information, all of those basic principles that I spoke about earlier really do make a difference across the continuum, both for patients and families, but also they're very supportive for staff. And usually the burden of care falls upon the staff. So I think if they can work together and do it in the guidelines of what the patients and families are capable of doing, and then work from there, it makes a bigger difference. And I think the outcomes have been proven by following these principles that you do get better results. And everyone on the team tends to be able to play a role and feel that they have accomplished something within the process.
David, your perspective?
Sure. I would add to what Martie is saying. In my time at the National Cancer Institute over the last 2 years, there's been a real significant movement among the cancer research community to go beyond the traditional approach to doing research and science and discovery, which has largely been the patients are the subjects, and we recruit them, we study them, but we don't really communicate with them, and we don't really engage them. Well, there's a movement called citizen science now that's getting a lot of traction at the NIH and at NCI. And there are organizations, patients like me and other smart patients, companies that have emerged to really engage patients or consumers. I think all of us have to become much more involved in health and healthcare. And as the science matures, as there's more research evidence, that evidence has got to be translated into usable resources for us as individuals. That's the only way we could possibly manage the cost burden of healthcare. I mean, we are in a major challenging time of trying to manage the increasing costs. And I think we have opportunities. That's where the technology piece comes in. From my view, it's an enabler. It isn't about becoming less human. It's about connecting us more. So back to the communication and engagement. So I'm very optimistic. I always have been an optimist. I think hearing about the science in particular, sort of the fundamental science is advancing rapidly, and the tools and resources that can be used to make that science more actionable is also happening. So you bring the two together, and it's really a remarkable time.
So to add to that, I think the challenge as a psychiatrist or mental health clinician is that people come with very nebulous symptoms sometimes, and they're trying to get a handle of it, and they're lost within the experience they have of the world. And the privilege of helping them through them is to put some boundaries and to help put these symptoms into some classification, something that makes sense to them, not to label them, not to create a diagnosis that doesn't mean anything, but to give them a sense that this is something that can be tackled, it can be quantified, it can be managed, that there's strategies that you're going to stick with them through this and help them through it. And I think one of my work has been focused on one of the major pieces, which is to try and validate and explain some of these very ill-described experiences that people have by providing a biological underpinning for them. And obviously we still have a long way to go, and there's work in some functional imaging efforts and also genetic basis for some of these susceptibilities. But if we can do that, we help them, as Martie said, to talk to their own family members that they have a brain condition, that there's something happening, and so that they can get support and not feel like they're at fault, or that they don't stigmatize themselves as they navigate a very complex condition.
So in addition to what's been said, and sort of in the context of what's been said, I think one of the challenges and opportunities is to understand plasticity in the brain, how it is that there's experience-dependent learning, how it is that the brain changes. When we went to med school, we were told that that neurons lost their pluripotential nature because they're so highly specialized that they can't do that anymore. Well, what we're learning now with neural stem cells in the context of neurodevelopment is that that's not the case at all, and that there are trophic factors, and there are genes and a whole set of epigenetic changes that regulate changes in the local neuronal circuits of the brain with experience, for good or for ill, and are involved in these illnesses. And that provides an inroad into therapeutics, because we can change where the software meets the hardware in the brain, if you will, and where experience meets biology and genetics in the brain. And so I think that's an exciting and important area.
Great, thank you. So I do a lot of scuba diving, which causes me to constantly be aware of my air pressure gauge. I'm getting constant updates here on the amount of time left in the panel. So I have some experience in dealing with that, and I want to leave a little time for conversation as well. So let me ask one last question, which maybe we'll ask David and Hadine to address as our clinician researchers, and then turn it open to the audience as well. So what do you see, for you as kind of the low-hanging fruit in your own areas of research over the next 4 or 5 years where you're most hopeful for a breakthrough?
I think with respect to sort of the technology-enabled approach of delivering care, I believe that we can deliver population health level care, evidence-based care, drawing from the science, translating it, and disseminating it at a population level, which we've never really been able to do in this country. And I think that is the imperative we have, to do all we can to promote that, so that there's greater access to evidence-based services for mental health and behavioral health care, and that we can support a healthier nation as a consequence. So I think that's really reachable in the next 5 to 10 years.
Hadine?
Did you want to? So to add to that, we are now in a situation where we fortunately have a capacity to genotype and phenotype our psychiatric patients, and to create a precision psychiatry and to personalize the intervention, whereas historically we've had very broad diagnoses. Depression is a very broad and heterogeneous condition, and we don't have 100% response with a number of our treatments, but if we can determine who's most likely to respond to more specifically targeted interventions based on a certain profile, we are likely to have greater outcome.
David?
I could say a lot, but in the interest of time, I think it was very well said.
Great. Questions from the audience? Yes.
I don't know, maybe it was about 10 years ago, the progress in this field was largely, people were very excited about pharmaceuticals being part of the magic bullet to address some of these diseases. And it's interesting today, I don't think many of you have mentioned that at all. Do you feel that that is a future trend going forward?
Yeah, it's a great point. The reason we didn't focus upon it is because, and I think Richard can confirm this from the industry point of view, is that there have been a lot of Me Too drugs with mechanisms that were found serendipitously, and really what we're aiming for now is a new generation of targeted signaling pathway-based drugs. So that's the first thing. Now, there is a move away from the traditional monoamines, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, et cetera, and that's very exciting. There's a lot of work now on GABA and glutamate. There's some work on rapidly acting antidepressants where you don't have to wait weeks for them to kick in, where a person could kill themselves in the meantime, and then you have to see if it works or not and cross your fingers. So I think there's a lot of excitement about these sorts of things, but it's a work in progress. The other thing that you heard us talk about is neuromodulation more broadly, ranging from cognitive behavioral therapy, which modulates the brain, using the brain itself to do that. We're studying mindfulness as well as a way to do that, or brain stimulation. But we are actively engaged in first-in-human trials, and I think that's where the Brigham can really shine, not to be the 17th site for some drug for Eli Lilly or something, not to name company names, but rather to do the first-in-human proof of concept work that's based upon a mechanism, and that's what we're working on now. If I could finally say, the other thing is, just like cancer or hypertension, we have to work towards cocktails for people. No, not literally. I don't think you never know. So yeah, it's one way to modulate GABA, but as we learn more about these intersecting biological pathways, you'll be able to, in a precision, individualized way, biologically, prescribe this intervention for this part of it, this intervention for this part of it, this intervention for this part of it, and in a way that's synergistic and beyond the sum of its parts, you'll be able to have a therapeutic effect, and we're interested in those sorts of things as well.
Great. I've been told it's time for this panel at least to surface for air. So thank you very much. The panel.